Thunderhead by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 10. As Goblin developed, there were changes in his appearance and behaviour. Certain habits left him, certain coltish accomplishments were acquired. The scrabble was gone, and in its place came the long springing trot characteristic of young colts, this owing perhaps to an inch or two of added length on each leg. He learned the art of wrestling. His usual antagonist was Pepper, a tall black colt. On an expanse of level ground where the wind had blown off most of the snow, they galloped in opposite directions, circling in figure eights. When they passed each other at the centre point, they would pause, rear, and strike at each other. Here began the beautiful play, bending to one side or the other, intertwining heads, then sliding down, almost kneeling to bite at the foreleg, rising high on hind legs again to exchange a flurry of boxing blows, their manes and tails, the black and white, lifted and stiffened by burning vigour until they flared like open fans. Suddenly the young stallions would plunge past each other and, as if in a prearranged dance routine, rush away in the figure eights again, their hooves thundering on the ground. Goblin also became an accomplished bucker. On icy mornings, when the sun blazed down and the air was a fierce intoxication, all the colts broke away from their dams and banded together for play. They raced up and over the brow of a gentle rise and came down the other side bucking. A few playful bucks sufficed for most of the colts, but not for Goblin. His bounds became higher, his legs stiffer, the twist of his solid, powerful little body more acute. It seemed to go to his head. At last he would be alone there, when the game was all over, bucking solo in a mad, intemperate ecstasy. When, in December, the spring colts were weaned and kept at the ranch for handling and graining, Goblin was left on the range. No more wrestling or boxing now, for he had no playmate, and when he tried it with Banner, rearing before him and putting up his fists, the big stud went on grazing, oblivious of his existence. Goblin played alone. He raced on the curving hills, thundered in figure eights, reared and shadow-boxed, put down his head and bucked, sunfished, jackknifed, corkscrewed. He knew them all. 3 times more before his 6 months of nursing were completed, Banner swept the whole band down to the ranch, for not a month passed without a blizzard. Goblin came to know the way so well that he tried to shoulder to the front, and only his lack of speed kept him from being there. One day, after a heavy blizzard, he was not allowed to return to the saddleback. He was to be weaned. The fury of the wind was dying away, and only occasionally sent up a cone of whirling snow. Ken McLaughlin, warmly dressed in a blue ski suit and cap, stood in the stable corral, holding Flicka's halter. He had been summoned home for one of his winter weekends to witness the weaning of Goblin. The corral was mid-leg deep in snow, churned to slush by the milling of the broodmares. For 2 days they had been in and out of the stable doors, in and out of the corral gates, free to leave when they wished, free to stay and fill themselves with hay and oats. Ken's face, pale from the winter confinement and the cold, was full of peaceful love as he looked into Flicka's eyes and stroked her forelock. His thin, sensitive lips slightly parted. Flicka's golden coat had darkened with the cold. Running his hand down her neck under her thick blonde mane, Ken felt the hair deep as fur. Her chest was broad and strong, her wide nostrils flared as she breathed. And her legs, oh, why couldn't Goblin have had those long slim legs of a runner? Flicka was with foal again. Standing there with her young master, she was paying no attention to him. She was looking over his head towards the green, her ears strained forward. Now and then her whole body shook in an anguished whinny. It was in that direction that they had led her a few minutes before, with Goblin following. Then they had brought her back without him. He was down there, with all the other colts, shut into the corral which adjoined the big cow barn below the green. She whinnied violently again, ending in a series of short groans. Ken patted her face and talked to her. "Don't you care, Flicka? Pretty soon you won't mind so much. You'll have a new baby, and it's better for you not to be nursing him. You've been getting thin. I can feel your ribs under your fur coat." Ken was torn between the desire to stay with his mare and comfort her, and go down to the goblin. He stayed with the mare. Benner had wandered out towards the county road gate. Evidently, he had had enough of domesticity. He began to call his mares and round them up. The afternoon light was failing, and the full moon, that had been nothing but a transparent globule of mist, was turning to bright silver. When the last of the band had followed Benner out, Ken led his mare into the stable, filled her feed box with oats, and left, closing the door behind him. Then he exploded into a swift run, tore down the gorge, across the green, the colour flaring into his face, his blue eyes darkening with excitement. Now the goblin, now his racehorse, now at last. As he opened the gate into the corral, his father held up a hand and Ken moved quietly. The last 15 minutes had been full of shocks for the goblin. In the excitement of meeting his old friends and investigating this new place, Goblin had not at first realized he had been separated from his mother. Then he heard her anguish neighing. That whirled him around and started him towards her. The 5-foot fence stopped him. The gate was closed. He was completely penned in. He raced around the enclosure seeking an exit. A confusion of feelings stirred him. There were the colts crowding around him, Pepper, the tall black, rearing and begging for a game. A strange, intriguing smell came from the long centre trough. He wanted to investigate that, but he was still angry. He didn't know what to do. At the sight of Goblin, Ken's heart began to pound. What a change! The colt had grown all over, so that he was still shaped like a mature horse, most odd-looking, but there was no mistaking the power in him. Measuring him quickly against the others, Ken saw that he was as big as the biggest and oldest of them. In 6 months he had caught up. Ken advanced slowly into the middle of the corral and held out his hand, calling the colt by name. Goblin stopped running around and looked at Ken. The colt's big head reached forward. His legs were planted stubbornly. His teeth showed between his black lips, and there was the white ring around his eye. Ken called him again. Impelled by insatiable curiosity, Goblin approached the boy cautiously, obliged to satisfy himself as to this small human being, not much taller than himself, and why memory rang a bell at sight of him. His muzzle strained forward, his body held back. He got one sniff, and at the same time Ken's hand moved to pat his nose. The colt's ears flew back. He whirled and lashed with his heels. Ken ducked. "Pretty close," laughed Rob. "You've got to be fast with that fellow." "Gosh, how he's grown," marvelled Ken. "Bigger than any of the others, isn't he, Dad?" "He's a husky." Goblin was tearing around the fence. It made a wild fury in him that there was no way out. In the other corral, when they came down from the range in a storm, the gates were always left open. They were there of their own free will. Even when they crowded into the barn, there was a different feeling. He began to buck. This wasn't bucking in fun. This was protest. This was pure fight. He went through his repertoire. The other colts got out of the way, and Rob and Gus retreated to the fence. "Yiminy crickets!" exclaimed Gus. "Look at dot colt buck!" The goblin tied himself in a knot. His nose and 4 hoofs bunched, twisted and bounced, stiff-legged 3 feet off the ground. "It's the bronc in him," said Rob disgustedly. "He'll never make a racehorse unless he gets over that." Racehorse. The word went through Ken like a flame. Did his father really believe, then, as he himself believed? Gus walked along the trough, pouring oats from a bucket. The other colts jammed around him, scrimmaging with each other, burying their noses in the trough. Rob's harsh voice rose, reprimanding them. He liked good manners in his horses. "Here, you fellas, cut that out." At his voice, Goblin stopped bucking, looked around, shook himself, then, realizing that he was missing something, rushed to the trough. He forced himself through the crowd, biting and kicking, stuck his nose in, and took a mouthful of the oats. Then he whirled away to the fence and stood there, mouthing the oats, thinking it all over. That night, across the vast expanse of the snows, flattened under the bright moonlight, Ken rode Flicka bareback up the saddleback and down the length of it, looking for the brood mares. He went very slowly, to make it last longer. He had played a trick on his father. He had kept Flicka in the stable instead of sending her with Banner, just so that he could ride her out alone that night and ski back. It hadn't fooled Rob. He had looked at his son hard until Ken had to drop his eyes, but after all, he had said he could go. Far down the ridge, Ken found the mares, inky black shadows against the whiteness. Banner came sweeping out to get Flicka. Ken dropped his skis to the ground, dismounted, and removed the bridle. Some knowledge of further and more permanent separation from her colt came to Flicka, and she neighed wildly and tried to run away from the stallion. Ken watched the chase, the circling, the dodging, the racing side by side. It ended as such chases always ended. Banner drove the mare ruthlessly where he willed, and the two dark figures merged in the band of broodmares. One last whinny of despair came ringing down the ridge to Ken. The boy stood, powerless to move, looking around. It was all too much for him, the snowy world too vast, the silence too eternal, the solitude too awful. For a moment his abnormally sharpened consciousness detached itself, making him see himself standing there, a small, lonely, dark figure in the midst of the antlerless whiteness. He felt the impact of all that was beyond him, the larger things, his future manhood, women and love, death. It hit him so sharply that he could have cried out in pain, and he looked up at the moon, trying to blink the hot tears from his eyes. Such swift maturing fused him to adult life before he was able to bear it. There is always a first moment of realization. In his fear and helplessness, the image of his mother rose before him. Her smile, the serene violet eyes, the feel of her hand on his hair, the way she would look at him, understanding, reading his heart. It needed only the sudden faraway howl of a timber wolf, the hunting owl, endlessly drawn long and melancholy, to make his heart burst into a flurry of pounding. His skis. He fastened them to his feet. A few strokes started him. Angling down the slope, it was downhill all the way. He gathered speed. The icy air burned his cheeks and roared in his ears and shattered his thoughts to bits. Death and terror, Nell, the wolf howl, they spun in his brain like a Roman wheel. Oh gosh, what fun! Speed and more speed. Watch out for that rock there. Hi! In a wild ecstasy, he opened his mouth and a long, exultant yell trailed behind him with two high curls of moon-silvered spray. Far back on the ridge, Flicka stood motionless among the dark shapes. Her head turned as if watching a white colt that was no longer there. That's the end of chapter 10.